He came to the grave to grieve, but found a boy crying, clutching a secret. He was the only one who saw me, the child whispered, and vanished into silence. Now Big Shaq must uncover what his nephew died protecting before the truth disappears again. In a town built on polite lies and quiet cruelty, one whistle might be the sound that brings it all crashing down.
One man, one boy, one secret that could burn it all.
Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from.
Share in the comments below.
Shaq never missed Sundays at the cemetery. It wasn't about routine. It wasn't about grief anymore either. It was about presence. His nephew Elijah had been gone nearly 2 years. But that spot beneath the maple tree, plot 7C in the south corner of Grayson Hills Memorial, still carried a silence that pulled at his chest. Not a heavy kind of sorrow, just weight. The kind that makes you sit longer than you mean to. It was always quiet there. Birds moving lazily between branches, the grass never quite dry, the hum of the town just distant enough to forget. Shaq didn't come with flowers. Elijah wouldn't have cared for them. He came with stories. Updates about life. About his mother's garden that never cooperated. About the Lakers. About nothing. It kept the boy alive in the space between memory and breath. But that morning was different. The moment Shaq turned off his car engine and stepped onto the gravel path, he felt it. A stillness, not the usual kind. This one had tension, like something unsaid was waiting behind the breeze. As he rounded the final curve toward Elijah's headstone, he stopped short. Someone was already there. A small figure, knees tucked to chest, hoodie swallowed by a denim jacket 2 sizes too big. At first he thought it might have been one of the local kids playing around, but then he saw the boy's face, pale, wet with tears, eyes locked on the headstone like it held the last truth in the world. Shaq approached slowly, not wanting to spook him. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, voice low, gentle. The boy flinched slightly but didn't look up. His voice was barely audible, trembling. "He was the only one who saw me." Shaq paused. A step away now. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. Skinny arms wrapped tightly around himself. He repeated it, this time with something deeper in his voice. Not just sadness, loneliness. "He was the only one who saw me." Shaq crouched beside him, not too close. The wind stirred the leaves overhead. "You talking about Elijah?" The boy nodded, once, then went still again. Shaq waited. He didn't pray. There was something in the way the kid sat, half hiding, half grounded, like he'd come here before. Like this wasn't new. "What's your name?" Shaq asked. The boy wiped his face, glanced sideways. "Landon." Shaq recognized the name. Grayson County's child welfare reports had mentioned a Landon Pierce a few months ago. Group home, behavioral issues, a file thick with labels no 10-year-old deserved. "What brings you here, Landon?" he asked, softer now. The boy swallowed, then looked up at Shaq for the first time. His eyes were green, rimmed with red. "He used to talk to me," he said, "when no one else would. He said I wasn't bad, just hurt." Shaq felt something shift in his gut. That sounded like Elijah. Always the one to reach where no one else bothered. "He gave me a peanut butter sandwich," Landon added. "Sat on the curb with me like I was normal." Shaq felt the corner of his mouth twitch into something like a smile, then fall again. Did he tell you anything?" Before he... Shaq couldn't finish the sentence. Even after all this time, the words wouldn't come. Landon didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. He unfolded it slowly and placed it on the grass next to the headstone. A small silver whistle scratched along the sides, but intact. "He told me to keep it close. Said if I ever got scared, I should blow it." Shaq stared at the whistle. He knew that whistle. Elijah used to carry it when he coached the summer league at the rec center. Said it wasn't for calling plays. It was for when kids needed help and couldn't say it out loud. Landon looked at him again. "I never blew it," he whispered. "I wanted to, but I thought it'd make things worse." The pieces didn't make sense yet, but something was wrong, deeper than a grieving kid visiting a grave. There was a story under the surface, buried in the boy's tight shoulders and too big jacket. Shaq could feel it. "You come here often?" Shaq asked. Landon nodded. "Why?" The boy's lips trembled again. "Because I think they're gonna forget him. Everyone else did, but I remember." A silence settled between them. Not empty, full of the weight of things unspoken. Shaq stood and looked around. The cemetery was still empty. No footsteps, no cars. No one else seemed to know this moment was happening. Just him, a boy, and a headstone.
You hungry?
Shaq asked. Landon hesitated, then nodded. Come on, Shaq said, offering a hand. I know a spot down the road with pancakes bigger than your face. Landon took it, slowly, like it had been a long time since anyone had offered without asking something in return. They walked back toward the car in silence. Shaq didn't ask anything else. Not yet. He didn't want to spook whatever thread was beginning to unwind. But he knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just a kid who missed Elijah. This was something else. Something heavier. When they drove off, the whistle stayed behind, glinting faintly in the grass, catching the sun as the wind moved over the grave. There's something about the past that never quite stays buried, not when it's unfinished. Shaq had always believed that time helped ease grief, not erase it. But grief wasn't the thing scratching at him now. It was something else, something colder. Something with a shape he couldn't quite make out yet. Driving through Grayson Hills, the streets felt smaller than he remembered. Same storefronts, same cracked pavement, outside Margot's diner, same courthouse clock that was always 10 minutes slow. Yet every corner carried a hush, like the town itself was holding its breath. He looked at Landon in the passenger seat, quiet, looking out the window, clutching a peanut butter sandwich Shaq had grabbed from a gas station shelf. The boy had eaten slowly, like he didn't trust the food to last. Or maybe like he didn't trust this moment to be real. Shaq didn't press for more answers. Not yet. But the echo of Landon's words kept circling in his mind. He was the only one who saw me. That wasn't about kindness. That was about being seen in a place that teaches people to look away. Elijah was good at that. Seeing people. Even as a kid, he could read a room better than most grown men. He noticed who was left out, who was holding something back. He never made it a show, never tried to fix anyone. He just showed up. That's who he was. Shaq remembered the first time Elijah came to live with him. The boy was 13, newly orphaned, half lost in his own skin. He'd been bounced around between cousins and aunts who meant well but couldn't handle the weight. Shaq took him in without hesitation. There was something steady in the way Elijah carried his pain. Like he didn't want to bother anyone with it. He wasn't loud, but he wasn't shy either. Played ball in the park, tutored kids in algebra, volunteered on Saturdays at the local food pantry, even when he had no business doing so. People called him the kid with a grown man's soul. He laughed easy, but his eyes always carried something older. That's what made the official report so hollow. Accidental fall. No witnesses. Case closed. The words didn't match the boy Shaq knew. Elijah didn't make mistakes like that. He was careful. Always careful. And he never went out alone at night. Not without telling someone. But that night, no one heard from him. No call, no text, just silence. Then a call from the sheriff's office the next morning. Shaq had stared at the officer giving him the news, trying to make sense of the way his voice stayed neutral, like he was reading a parking violation. Said they found Elijah behind the community rec center. Head trauma from a fall. No foul play suspected. No questions answered. Just a body bag in a file. But Shaq had questions. Always did. They piled up in his chest unanswered and unwelcome. And now, 2 years later, a 10-year-old boy leaves a silver whistle at Elijah's grave like it's some kind of buried key. Shaq couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong. Elijah had been trying to protect this boy, or something bigger, and Landon knew more than he could say. Later that evening, after dropping Landon back at the group home gate, where a staff member took him with a quick nod and no eye contact, Shaq sat in his truck, hands gripping the wheel longer than necessary. The home looked fine from the outside. Brick walls, a modest lawn, even a small garden near the back fence. But it felt too quiet. Not the good kind. The kind that smothers. The kind where kids don't laugh, unless they're sure no one's listening. Shaq pulled out his phone and started calling. Not officials. He knew better than that. Not yet. He needed the people who remembered Elijah the way he did. His first stop was Lenny Crawford, the custodian at the rec center. Lenny had worked there for 20 years, seen every kid come through from t-ball to high school tryouts. When Shaq showed up unannounced, Lenny didn't ask questions, just nodded and unlocked the back door. They sat in the gym bleachers, lights off except for the exit signs glowing red. "I still see him," Lenny said, his voice dry with smoke and age. "Coming in early, staying late. That boy loved these kids. Used to walk one of the little ones home every Tuesday 'cause his mama worked nights. You remember a kid named Landon? Shaq asked. Lenny's eyes flicked sideways. He didn't answer right away. Yeah, he said eventually. Skinny thing, always watching the doors. Used to hide behind the vending machine till Elijah coaxed him out with gummy worms. Shaq nodded slowly. He say anything about trouble? Something going on? Lenny hesitated. He said some of those boys from the group home came back different. Quieter. Shaky. One kid cried whenever someone touched his shoulder. Elijah didn't like it. Said he was gonna ask questions. Shaq leaned forward. Did he? Lenny nodded once. Too many. That night Shaq didn't sleep. His mind reeled with fragments. A silver whistle. Shaky kids. A late night alone. Questions Elijah never got to finish. And that phrase, he was the only one who saw me. The next morning, Shaq drove across town to see Mrs. Harper, the retired school counselor. She had a memory like a steel trap, and eyes that made you sit up straight, even when you were pushing 40. She remembered Landon. Remembered Elijah too. Landon didn't trust adults, she said, pouring tea that neither of them drank. But he followed Elijah around like a shadow. Told me once that Elijah said the world can't change if nobody listens. Shaq listened to that for a long moment. He said that? He asked. More than once, she replied. He believed it. Poor boy just didn't know how loud the silence could be when the wrong people are in charge. Shaq left with more questions than answers. But there was something else now. A hum in the air. Like the quiet in town wasn't just grief. It was avoidance. People remembered Elijah. They remembered Landon too. But no one wanted to connect the dots. Like saying it out loud might break something. Back in his garage that night, Shaq went through Elijah's old boxes. Not much, just a few notebooks, a tablet with a cracked screen, some photos, and a stack of index cards, bound with a rubber band. Notes, schedules, names. He flipped through them slowly, stopping on a card with the words Tuesday fence check. Landon won't say why, scrawled in Elijah's handwriting. Fence check. That clicked something loose. Shaq grabbed his keys and drove straight to Grayson Hills Park. Behind the rec center, behind the second baseball diamond, there was a chain-link fence that separated the park from the backfield of the group home. It was rusty, sagging in places. And there, near the base of the far left post, the grass was flattened, like someone had been there often, kneeling, hiding. He crouched down, brushing away a few loose stones. Nothing at first. But then his fingers brushed something small, round. A button. Faded, torn from a shirt or maybe a uniform. Shaq pocketed it and stood up, scanning the area. He didn't see anyone, but he felt watched. As he walked back toward the car, one thought grew louder than the rest. Elijah had seen something. He hadn't fallen. He'd been silenced. And now Landon, small, scared, and half invisible, was holding the final thread. Shaq wasn't sure what was waiting at the end of that thread. But he knew this much. He wasn't letting go. There's a kind of racism that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't burn crosses or wear hoods. It smiles, keeps its lawn trimmed, waves at block parties. It shows up in policy, in silence, in who gets believed and who doesn't. Shaq had seen both kinds, the loud, ugly kind that spits in your face, and the quiet kind that calls itself polite while watching you bleed. Grayson Hills prided itself on being a town that cares. Signs at the edge of Main Street said so, painted blue with sunflowers like a promise. But if you looked close, you'd notice the cracks. Not in the signs. In the way people changed their tone when certain names came up. In the way their smiles turned tight when Shaq asked about Elijah. It started the moment he walked into Greeley's Hardware, a shop where Elijah used to help out during high school summers. Shaq hadn't been inside since before the funeral. He half expected a welcome back or a warm nod from Mr. Greeley, the owner. Instead, Greeley glanced up from the register and said, "You need something." Shaq pointed toward a pack of batteries, made small talk about old fixtures, then eased into what he really came for. "You remember Elijah?" he asked, casual. Greeley's mouth twitched. "Good kid. Tragic what happened. You ever hear anything else about that night? Anything that didn't make the news?" Greeley shook his head too quickly. "Just what they said. Fell. Head trauma. That's all I know." Shaq let it hang in the air. "He worked here a while, right?" "Yeah. Couple summers. Quiet. Polite. Did his job. Then after a pause, didn't talk much." "That wasn't true." Elijah talked, just not to people who didn't listen. Shaq knew this kind of deflection, harmless on the surface, but just evasive enough to close a door. Back in his truck, Shaq scribbled notes on a yellow pad. Greeley knew more, dodged, changed subject, afraid, loyal. The pattern became clearer the more places he visited. People nodded, offered condolences, but always backed off when he brought up Elijah's final days. Ms. Riley, the librarian, clutched her cross tighter when he asked if Elijah had checked out any books on legal procedure. Coach Darnell at the high school said he remembered Elijah giving Landon rides, but couldn't say much about a group home matter. Everyone had limits, invisible lines they refused to cross. But Shaq had crossed lines before. Later that afternoon, he sat in the back booth of Marla's Cafe, a place that hadn't changed since the 90s. Plastic booths, cracked vinyl menus, and a jukebox that still played Earth, Wind and Fire for quarters. It was neutral ground. People talked here when they didn't want to be seen talking anywhere else. He was meeting Isaiah Connors, a former assistant director of youth services, who had quietly left his post 3 months after Elijah's death. He came in wearing a ball cap low over his eyes and kept looking toward the windows, like he expected someone to follow. "Appreciate you meeting me," Shaq said. Isaiah sat stiffly, hands folded. "You said it was about Elijah." "Yeah, you worked around him. Around Landon too." Isaiah nodded slowly. "I did." Shaq leaned forward. "What's going on in that group home?" Isaiah glanced around the cafe, then exhaled. "What's going on, or what no one wants to admit is going on?" Shaq stayed silent. Isaiah lowered his voice. "Kids disappear from the paperwork. Not physically, but their stories. Complaints go missing. Staff turnover gets reported as routine, even when it's not. Landon filed a complaint once about a staff member pulling him by the collar and locking him in the garage for 2 hours. It vanished. I didn't even see it until I was cleaning out my office. It had a red void stamp across the top." Shaq's jaw tightened. "They say those kids are troubled," Isaiah continued. "Easier to believe the problem is with the child than the system watching them." "Did Elijah know?" Shaq asked. Isaiah nodded. "He was building something, gathering notes, asking the right people the wrong questions. And then he died." Isaiah didn't say anything for a long time. When he did, it was quiet. "Some towns protect their shadows, Shaq. Especially when those shadows wear uniforms." That night, Shaq parked outside the group home and just watched. The place looked normal. Some lights on upstairs, a flicker of a TV, 2 boys tossing a ball under the porch light. But it felt wrong. Landon's room was the 3rd window from the left, 2nd floor. A faint glow showed behind the curtain. He thought about going to the door, demanding answers, but something in his gut told him not yet. Not without more. Instead, he drove across town to the old VFW hall, now turned into a part-time community center. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he saw the mural painted by Elijah and a group of teens the summer before he died. It stretched across the brick wall in deep reds and blues, showing kids with open hands passing books, tools, paintbrushes, and in the center, a boy holding a whistle in one hand, a mirror in the other. Shaq hadn't noticed that detail before. It was Landon. Not a perfect likeness, but close. And that mirror, the way it reflected light across the wall, scattering into different shapes, felt symbolic. Like Elijah knew something would be buried, and left pieces of truth in plain sight. The next morning, Shaq tracked down Etta Monroe, the director of the group home. She answered the door in pearls and a cardigan, sipping tea like someone preparing for a church interview. "I'd like to ask about Landon," Shaq said. Her smile was tight, but rehearsed. "He's one of our more delicate cases. He's also a 10-year-old who visits a grave most adults are afraid to approach." She blinked, not expecting the tone. "I don't think this is the place," she started. "I'm not here to make noise. I'm here to understand what Elijah was trying to fix." At that, her composure faltered, just slightly. "Elijah was a kind young man," she said, "but he became over-involved. We have protocols for how our staff interacts with residents. He was warned for helping a scared kid, for stepping outside boundaries," she replied. Shaq stared at her for a long time, watching the cracks form. "What happens when a kid crosses one of yours?" She looked at the floor. He left with nothing definitive. But her silence said enough. Later that week, Shaq visited Pastor Clemens, the man who mentored Elijah since he was 15. The church smelled like old wood and lemon polish. sunlight cutting through the stained glass like filtered memory. He came to me 3 days before he died, the pastor said. Said he felt like something was closing in, that he'd stumbled into something bigger than he could carry.
Did he say what it was?
The pastor hesitated. He had names. He didn't give them to me. Said he'd write them down. Make copies. Said the truth had to live in more than one place. Shaq sat in the pew for a long time after that, thinking, piecing it together. Elijah had found something, documented it, probably planned to hand it off to someone he trusted. Maybe he never got the chance. Or maybe he did, and someone made sure it got buried. But if that truth was still out there somewhere, it had to be in the hands of someone Elijah trusted. Back at home, Shaq opened a cabinet and pulled out a small wooden box. Elijah had given it to him the summer before his death, said it was just for keepsakes. Inside were old ticket stubs, a photo of Elijah's basketball team, and folded carefully beneath the lid, a note in Elijah's handwriting. Untruth can be loud, but silence? That's where rot grows. If something happens to me, don't ask how, ask why. Shaq sat back, the weight of the message pressing into his chest like a second heartbeat. Elijah wasn't careless. He didn't stumble into tragedy. He was hunted by truth. And now, Landon was the only living thread still untouched. The town smiled too tightly. The cops asked questions in circles. The group home masked cruelty, with rules. But Shaq had never been one to sit still while rot settled in. He looked out the window at the dusk folding over Grayson Hills. A town that looked away was about to get a reason to look again. Some truths don't arrive as words. They come in fragments, colors, symbols, broken shapes. Sometimes the only way to say something unspeakable is to draw. Shaq learned this the moment Landon handed him the sketchbook. It happened on a gray afternoon, just after a rainstorm that had left Grayson Hills glistening but colder than usual. Shaq had picked Landon up from the group home, under the pretense of needing help organizing storage boxes at the rec center. It was the only excuse the home's director didn't question. The staff didn't mind the kid being gone a few hours. They saw him as quiet, manageable, too withdrawn to raise trouble. But Shaq saw something else brewing beneath the surface. Landon hadn't said much on the drive, and Shaq hadn't pushed him. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was thoughtful. It was weighty. When they reached the rec center, Shaq led him to the office Elijah used to use on Sundays, a small back room behind the gym, filled with unopened board games and half-deflated basketballs. It smelled like old linoleum and dusted chalk. Landon moved carefully, scanning the walls, pausing for a long moment at the corner shelf where Elijah kept his water bottles and notebooks. That's when Landon reached into his backpack. He pulled it out slowly, like it might change shape the moment he touched it. A worn navy blue sketchbook, corners curled, the cover scratched and sun-bleached. He didn't say anything as he handed it over, just gave Shaq a small, solemn nod. Shaq took it carefully, already feeling the weight in his palms before he opened it. The first few pages were what you'd expect from a 10-year-old trees. Clouds, cars, a sun with a smile, but even those held something unusual. The lines were clean, deliberate. The colors weren't always right, but they were thoughtful. A red sky, a green crow, a boy with no mouth standing next to a man with no face. Then the pages started shifting. Around the 6th page, Shaq paused. It showed a figure, small, barefoot, hunched beneath a fence, with tall grass around it. Just beyond the fence stood a man with a sheriff's badge, hands on his belt. The man's face wasn't drawn. Instead, it was a black void, swirling. Behind him, fire. Not literal flames, but orange and red scribbled across the sky, stretching down like claws. Above it all, in the top right corner, barely noticeable, was a silver dot with lines coming from it. Shaq recognized it instantly. The whistle. He turned the next page. The images got darker. A door, bolted shut from the outside. A window with bars. A boy curled up in the corner with a single tear. Another image, a broken chain dangling from a post, with birds flying out from behind it, each bird drawn with hollow eyes. Landon sat silently across from him, watching without blinking. Shaq didn't speak. He kept turning the pages. Then came the one that stopped him. It was Elijah. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was him. The posture, the hair, even the scar near his eyebrow, captured in pencil and pain. He was drawn mid-motion, running, his mouth open, like he was shouting, his hands stretched out behind him, reaching toward something. or someone, and chasing behind him was a large figure with the same sheriff's badge as before, this time drawn with jagged black lines, as if the pencil had been pressed too hard. The sheriff's hand was reaching, too, but not to save, to Shaq closed the sketchbook. Carefully. The air in the room had changed. He looked at Landon. "Did you see this?" he asked softly. Landon nodded. His chin trembled, but he didn't cry. Shaq's chest tightened. He wanted to ask a dozen questions. Who was the man? What happened that night? Did Elijah tell you to run? But he knew better. The sketchbook was the answer. This was how the boy was telling the story, and rushing it would break the thread. So he waited. Landon finally whispered, "I tried to draw what I couldn't tell." Shaq reached across the table and rested a hand on the boy's. "You did," he said. "You did good." They sat there for a while, the only sound the tick of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the floor as the gym settled. Landon eventually pulled the sketchbook back and held it to his chest like a shield. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the picture of Elijah still etched in his mind. His nephew running, trying to protect this boy, running from someone. And now, Landon was hiding behind paper, still afraid of what might happen if the wrong person saw those drawings. Shaq understood something then. Telling the truth wasn't just dangerous, it was a gamble. And Landon, despite all his fear, had just bet on Shaq. That night, Shaq took the sketchbook home and locked it in a drawer. Not because he didn't want to believe it, but because he knew what it meant to hold something that heavy. Evidence. Testimony. A truth wrapped in graphite and courage. He spent the next morning making quiet calls. No police. No news outlets. Just people who knew Elijah and owed him honesty. He showed one or two the sketch of Elijah running. Every time it drew silence. One man, Daryl Meade, who used to coach football with Elijah, stared at it for almost a full minute before saying, "That ain't no dream, that's something he saw." And that's when Shaq made a decision. He wasn't going to take the sketchbook to the authorities yet. Not without more. Landon had taken a risk showing it. If it got out too soon, someone might make it disappear, or worse. So he returned to Landon the next day, this time taking him to the art supply store on the edge of town. They walked the aisles quietly. Shaq buying more sketchbooks, pencils, colored charcoal. He didn't say why. Landon understood. In the car, Landon finally spoke. "Sometimes when I draw, it's like I'm not scared." Shaq nodded. "Then keep drawing." They spent that afternoon in silence again. Landon sketching in the corner of the rec center office. Shaq reviewing notes, old photos, even revisiting Elijah's handwriting, which he'd started to recognize in places he hadn't noticed before. Elijah had once told him, "People think truth's a flashlight, but it's more like a lit match. You gotta move fast before it burns out." That line haunted him now. Later that evening, after dropping Landon off, Shaq took a detour past the sheriff's office. From the outside, it looked like any small-town department. Flag flapping, porch lights on, two cruisers parked out front. But now Shaq saw it differently. Not as a building, but as a gatekeeper. Somewhere inside might be the man in Landon's sketch. The badge, the hand reaching. He didn't know who it was yet. But the pieces were falling into place. In Landon's pages held the map. There's a difference between silence and secrecy. Silence is absence. Secrecy is intention. Shaq had learned to tell the two apart by watching people. How they hesitated. How they said too little, or far too much. But with Landon, there was no game. Only the slow unraveling of a burden far too large for a child to carry. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after the sketchbook had opened, a door neither of them could close. Shaq had picked Landon up under the usual pretense, storage help, rec center cleanup. The group home staff barely looked up as the boy walked out, his coat zipped high, sketchbook pressed to his side like a secret. Shaq had planned to spend the afternoon sifting through Elijah's old files, maybe rechecking names on the church volunteer lists. But as they pulled onto the main road, Landon spoke for the first time that day. "I don't like the fence," he said quietly, eyes on the window. Shaq glanced at him, sensing weight behind the words. "What fence?" Landon was quiet for a long time. Then, "The one near the graveyard. That's where he gave me the whistle. Told me to run." Shaq slowed the car, a jolt of something old tightening in his chest. He didn't answer right away, didn't want to crush the moment with urgency. But the words echoed. "That's where he gave me the whistle." Not a whistle. The whistle. He knew which one. It had been a joke at first. Shaq's son, Devin, used to carry the silver toy around like a badge, said it was his superhero call. Elijah gave it to him when he was 6, said, "You blow this. Someone's coming for you. No matter what." It wasn't just a toy. It was a promise. That whistle had vanished years ago. Or so Shaq thought. "Can you show me?" Shaq asked. Landon nodded slowly. They drove in silence to Grayson Hill's memorial. The graveyard was quiet as ever, though a soft wind moved through the trees like a whisper, carrying leaves that skittered across the gravel path. Landon led them, not to Elijah's grave, but around the side past the maintenance shed, through a narrow patch of woods that hadn't been trimmed in years. There, hidden behind thorny brush and half-collapsed branches, was a chain-link fence, old, weather-worn, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. The other side opened into a vacant field, then stretched out toward the back of the group home. Shaq crouched, his hand running along the fence's base. Cold metal, soft dirt. Landon pointed without speaking. Shaq pushed aside a few loose stones and leaves, and there it was, a flash of silver, small, dull now, but unmistakable. The whistle. He picked it up carefully, brushing off soil. It was scratched and slightly bent along one edge, but the engraving was still there. DJS Devin Jamal. Shaqson. His son's initials. Shaq stared at it, feeling a memory slide into place like a puzzle piece that had been missing too long. The day Elijah gave it to Devin had been after a rough week at school. Some older boys had cornered him behind the cafeteria. No bruises, no marks, just words. But Shaq had never seen his son so small. Elijah had knelt beside him, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "People try to shrink what scares them. Don't let them. This whistle is yours. It means you're never alone." Shaq swallowed hard. "How did Elijah have this?" he asked, voice low. Landon shrugged. He had it in his hand that night. When he came to the fence, he was breathing fast. He told me to take it and run. Said not to stop until I was past the pond. "What happened before that?" Landon looked down. "There was yelling. I saw someone chase him from the trees. I was hiding. I wanted to help, but he told me not to." Shaq's hand tightened around the whistle. He stood and scanned the fence. Behind it, the trees formed a narrow path, just wide enough for someone to move through quickly. Elijah had been here, running, cornered, protecting Landon. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall. Someone had been chasing him, and Elijah had led them away from the boy. Shaq looked back at Landon, who was now sitting on a low stump, sketchbook in his lap, pencil in hand. He wasn't drawing yet, just holding it like it gave him strength. Shaq sat beside him. "You remember who was chasing him?" Landon's pencil moved. Slowly. A circle. A star shape inside it. Then a rectangle beneath it. A badge. "Was it a cop?" Shaq asked gently. Landon's hand stopped. Then he nodded. Shaq felt the cold edge of fury press against his ribs, but he breathed through it. This story wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth, and truth had to be steadier than rage. They stayed at the fence for over an hour. Shaq examined the trees, the line of sight from the graveyard, the field's path toward the group home. It was possible someone had seen something, just not admitted it. When they returned to the car, Landon handed him the sketch he'd just drawn. It showed the fence, the trees, and a shadowed figure crouched behind a bush. Landon, watching, on the far edge of the sketch was a face, not clearly drawn, but familiar. Elijah. His posture was the same as the sketch in the book days earlier, mid-run, mouth open, but this one showed the moment after, a hand stretched out behind him, not reaching for Landon this time, reaching to toss the whistle. The symbolism struck Shaq hard. Elijah's final act had been to pass safety on. Not for himself, for the boy. They drove back in near silence. But something had shifted. Landon looked calmer. Not safe, but seen. And Shaq carried the whistle in his pocket now, as if it still held the echo of Elijah's voice. That night, Shaq laid the whistle on his kitchen counter and stared at it. The metal had dulled, but it felt alive somehow, warm, purposeful. He thought about Devin, about how symbols become anchors, and he thought about how Elijah had always carried too much alone. He walked to his living room, pulled out an old shoebox from the hallway closet. Elijah's box. Inside were crumpled receipts, concert stubs, a folded napkin with a phone number scribbled on it. Shaq sifted through slowly, and there, Near the bottom, he found something else, a photo. It was Elijah, Landon, and two other boys, one of them from the group home, the other Shaq didn't recognize. They were standing by a rusted metal fence, smiling. Behind them, barely visible, was the edge of the graveyard, and in Elijah's hand, the whistle. The photo had a date stamp, 2 days before Elijah died. Shaq flipped it over. In faint ink, Elijah had written, "Teach them how to run, but also why they had to." The next morning, Shaq walked into the church and asked Pastor Clemens if he remembered any conversations about the fence. The pastor looked hesitant, then nodded. Elijah said it felt like the edge of something, like it was where people stopped looking. Shaq nodded. That's where it started. The pastor looked at the whistle in Shaq's hand. Funny. When he was little, he used to blow a toy whistle just to see if anyone would come. Shaq felt that one deep in his chest. He still did, he said. As he left the church, Shaq realized the next steps were no longer just about discovering what happened. They were about preserving it. Making sure the truth Elijah died protecting didn't fade under more layers of polite silence. Back at home, Shaq opened a fresh notebook. On the cover he wrote 2 words, defense. And inside he began sketching what Landon couldn't say. Landon, the pastor whispered. Shaq leaned forward, heart drumming. Elijah said he couldn't believe what he saw. They had Landon listed under level 4, isolation recommended, which meant no direct contact, no eye contact, no shared meals. He's 10, Shaq said, almost a whisper. Clemens nodded, and treated like a criminal. What was Elijah going to do? He wanted to go public, the pastor said. He talked about taking it to a journalist he trusted in Oak Ridge. Said if no one in Grayson Hills would listen, someone else had to. But I told him to be careful, that people like us don't always survive truth-telling. Shaq stood, pacing now. You told him to back off? I told him to stay alive. Clemens replied. I didn't know he'd already made copies. He was determined. Shaq turned slowly. So what happened that night? Clemens exhaled, shoulders slumping. That's what I didn't know until yesterday. Shaq froze. What do you mean until yesterday? I got a letter, the pastor said. No return address. Just a note, folded into one of the Bibles left in the second pew. He pulled it from his coat pocket. A crumpled piece of notebook paper, torn at the top. Shaq took it and read silently. I didn't mean to get him hurt. He told me to stay quiet, but I ran. He told me not to run. I just wanted to get away. I didn't know they'd follow him instead. He yelled my name, then he gave me the whistle. I ran faster, and he didn't. There was no signature. But the handwriting was small, familiar. Shaq sat down slowly. Landon, he said. Clemens nodded. He wasn't just a witness. He was the pivot. The reason Elijah ran. Shaq held the letter tight in his hand. It wasn't accusation. It was confession. Not guilt. Just heartbreak. And fear. He's been carrying this, Shaq said. All this time. I think Elijah knew, the pastor said. That's why he gave him the whistle. It wasn't just for safety. It was forgiveness. The basement grew quieter. Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour. But neither man moved. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on knees. There's something else, he said. Sketches. Landon draws what he can't say. And in them, there's a man. A badge. Chasing. Clemens went still. He told me he saw a deputy, not in uniform, but with a badge. You know which one. The pastor hesitated. No. But I have my suspicions. Shaq stood again. He wasn't pacing now. Just thinking. Turning the twist over in his head like a jagged stone. The tragedy wasn't that Elijah had died. It was that he had chosen to die in that moment. For someone else. He had known they would come after Landon. So he ran. He misdirected. He gave the boy a chance. And now, the boy was finally whispering the truth from places no one thought to check. Sketchbooks, notes in pews, symbols in the margins. We have to do something, Shaq said. The pastor nodded. But you have to be careful, son. They're not afraid of a boy with a sketchbook, but they'll be afraid of a man with a voice. Shaq looked down at the letter again, then folded it neatly and placed it inside his jacket. That's the plan. As he walked back up the church steps into the light, his breath caught in his throat. Not from fear, from weight. The truth wasn't a weapon, it was a responsibility now, and he had just become its keeper. Outside, the sky was overcast, but the wind had shifted. For the first time in weeks, he felt like something was moving in the right direction. That afternoon, he found Landon sketching on the porch of the rec center. Hood up, knees tucked. Shaq sat beside him. "I talked to Pastor Clemens," he said. "He showed me the note." Landon froze, then slowly turned his head. His eyes held no surprise, only quiet dread. "I didn't mean for him to," Landon started. "I know," Shaq interrupted, gently. "And he knew too. That's why he gave you the whistle. Not because he wanted you to escape. Because he needed you to." Landon blinked fast. "I was so scared." "You still are," Shaq said. "But you're not alone anymore." Landon lowered his head, pressing his pencil to the page, but his hands were shaking. Shaq placed his own sketchbook next to the boy's. It was empty. A symbol. "I need you to help me draw it," he said. "Everything. The fence, the badge, the face, if you can remember. Even the fire. We're going to show people." "Will they believe us?" Landon asked, voice barely audible. Shaq thought of the town, the silence, the faces that turned away. Then he thought of Elijah. "They'll have to," he said, "because we're not asking anymore." Landon didn't respond, but his pencil began to move again, not shaky this time. Steady, and just like that, the silence began to shift. The church basement had opened a door. The letter had lit the first match, and Shaq, guided by sketches, whispers and the quiet bravery of a grieving boy, was no longer chasing ghosts. He was chasing justice. Some truths don't wait forever. They fester. They ache in the chest until they twist everything inside. And for Landon, that ache had become a constant, quiet, but loud in the places that mattered most. Guilt doesn't age with you. It just settles deeper in your bones. The day began like the others. Quiet car ride, overcast skies, the sketchbook balanced on Landon's knees. But something felt heavier in the air. Shaq sensed it. Landon's hands weren't moving like usual. His pencil hovered over the page, not touching. His shoulders curled tighter into his hoodie. He wasn't hiding today. He was bracing for something. Shaq didn't say a word. He drove them out to the edge of town, past the gravel roads and the last gas station, all the way to the old fire tower that hadn't been used in years. No buildings, no noise, just wind and open air. A place where silence could stretch. They sat on the hood of the truck for a while. Shaq watched the horizon, waiting. Landon watched his shoes. When the boy finally spoke, his voice cracked like dry leaves. "It wasn't just a fence," he said. Shaq didn't move, just listened. "They used to take us back there. Not all of us, just the ones they didn't want seen." Shaq turned slowly. "Who's they?" Landon kept his eyes down. "Two of them. Deputies. Not the ones who wore uniforms to town hall or smiled in the church. The ones who came at night, said we were being toughened up. Said fear made boys into men." Shaq clenched his jaw but didn't interrupt. "They didn't hit us. Not where people could see. They used words mostly. Made you think you deserved it. That you were broken. That nobody would believe you anyway." He paused, breathing uneven. "I used to think maybe I was bad. That's why I didn't tell anyone." His voice got smaller. "But Elijah didn't think I was bad. He said they were the ones hiding." Shaq looked at him fully now, eyes soft. "Tell me what happened, Landon." "All of it." The boy hesitated, then nodded. "It was late. I had snuck out through the laundry room. I wasn't supposed to, but I couldn't sleep. I'd been drawing. I needed air." He swallowed hard, pulling his sleeves over his hands. "I heard voices near the fence. Angry. I thought it was just staff again, yelling at the older boys. But then I heard my name." Shaq stayed still. "They were talking about me, saying I needed to be scared straight. One of them said they should make it official this time. I didn't know what that meant. I ducked behind the shed. That's when Elijah showed up." Landon's hands were trembling now, fingers gripping the fabric of his sleeves. "He wasn't supposed to be there. I think he was looking for me. He always checked when I went quiet for too long." The boy's eyes glossed over, voice barely above a whisper. "He saw them, heard them. He told them to back off. Said he'd report them. Said he had proof." A long silence settled between them. One of them laughed. The other shoved him. Shaq didn't speak. He could feel the shape of it forming, could see it even without being told. "There was a root," Landon said, staring off into the trees beyond the fire tower. "Sticking out of the ground." His foot caught it. He hit the back of his head on the fence post. Landon's voice cracked then. A full stop. It took him a long time to breathe through it. He didn't move. Shaq's hands balled into fists at his sides. Not from anger, but from helplessness. From knowing what it must have looked like to a child. To watch someone fall, and then not get back up. What did the deputies do? Shaq asked, steady. They froze, Landon said. Then one of them said, no one saw. The other picked up Elijah's phone and threw it into the woods. His lip trembled. They dragged him to the other side of the fence. Said they'd call it an accident. Said he probably slipped while walking alone. Shaq stared at the ground, chest burning. And you? He asked. I ran, Landon whispered, like he told me to. Shaq closed his eyes. He could see it so clearly now. Elijah bleeding, hands stretched, tossing the whistle as his last act of protection. You told no one? They said if I did, I'd disappear too. Shaq exhaled slowly, grounding himself. You kept it inside all this time? Landon nodded. I thought it was my fault. If I hadn't gone out, if I hadn't run, maybe they wouldn't have seen him. Maybe he would have. Shaq stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Firm, present. You were a kid, Landon. And Elijah made a choice. He chose you. Don't ever carry shame for being saved. The boy let out a shuddered breath, the dam inside cracking. He didn't cry. Not in the loud cinematic way. It was quieter, barely a sound, but full of years of weight finally letting go. They stayed like that until the sky began to shift. Orange leaking through the gray like hope trying to get through. Shaq pulled out the sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, and handed it to him. Draw it, he said. All of it. The way you remember. Landon hesitated. Then picked up the pencil. What followed wasn't fast. It wasn't even clean, but it was real. The fence, the post, the trees. Elijah mid-step, the whistle mid-air. Two shadowed figures in the background. One with a badge barely visible beneath a jacket. Shaq watched as the boy poured it out. Not just memory, but pain, fear, release. And when he was done, he handed Shaq the book. I'm not hiding anymore, he said. Shaq nodded. Eyes damp but steady. That's good, he said. Because now, we go to war. The pastor opened the door with tired eyes. Shaq didn't waste time. They know, he said. Clemens led him inside without asking. They walked the length of the empty sanctuary, their footsteps soft against the wood. They stopped beneath the pulpit, the sunlight cutting through the stained glass across the altar floor. Shaq handed him the envelope. Clemens didn't speak as he sifted through the contents. When he reached the note, he closed his eyes. They're watching, he murmured. Shaq nodded. They're waiting to see if I flinch. What are you going to do? The pastor asked. Shaq's voice was calm, but certain. I'm going to do what Elijah didn't get to finish. But the boy Clemens began. I know, Shaq interrupted. That's the knot. I can't undo what happened, but I can decide what happens next. I just don't know how to protect him and expose them. Clemens walked to the pulpit, pulled something from beneath it, a small wooden box. Inside was a USB drive. Elijah left this with me, he said. Said if anything happened to him, I was to give it to someone who wouldn't fold. Shaq took it slowly.
What's on it?
Everything he found. Names, logs, dates, Landon's file, redacted police reports that don't match the originals. Shaq stared at the drive, the weight of it sinking into his palm. Why now? Because silence doesn't deserve loyalty, Clemens said. And you've already been marked. You might as well make it worth something. That night, Shaq sat at his dining room table with the drive in one hand and the photos in the other. He could feel the hours slipping like sand through fingers. This wasn't a threat that gave second chances. He opened his laptop, uploaded the contents of the drive, and made 5 copies. Flash drives. One hidden under the floorboard near the laundry room. Another in his truck. One in his safe at the rec center. 2 more mailed in unmarked envelopes to 2 trusted people in different towns. If they wanted to play shadow games, he would make sure the truth had more than one escape route. Then he picked up the phone and dialed Brenda Tolan. When she answered, her voice was cautious. Shaq? I have a story, he said. It's not about a town. It's about a boy, and a cover-up, and a choice that ended someone's life. There was a pause. Then a quiet, I'm listening. He didn't give everything. Just enough to get her attention. Names would come later. For now, he needed her ready. He ended the call and turned off the lights. For the first time in days, he let himself exhale. But just as he reached for the sketchbook to close it for the night, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He picked up. No voice. Just breathing. Calm. Measured. Then a click. The line went dead. Shaq stared at the screen. The game had shifted. They weren't warning him anymore. They were daring him. The hardest part of doing the right thing isn't deciding what to do. It's knowing who you might lose in the process. Shaq had carried a lot in his life. Grief, fame, pressure, but nothing like this. Nothing that asked him to gamble someone else's safety against the weight of silence. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Elijah die in the dark. The night air was thick with the kind of silence that carries anticipation. No sirens, no traffic, just the hum of what comes before a reckoning. Shaq sat in his den, the sketchbook open beside him, whistle resting on the windowsill, and the USB drive, Elijah's final offering, plugged into the laptop in front of him. He'd gone back and forth for hours, not out of fear for himself. He'd been threatened before. But because of Landon, the boy was still sleeping upstairs, curled on the guest bed, unaware that forces outside his control were already measuring the cost of his voice. Shaq clicked the final link. It led to an encrypted portal, set up by Brenda Tolan's investigative outlet. Anonymous, secure. No IP trace. Just a box that read, "Submit your evidence." He uploaded it all. The drive. Photos of the sketchbook pages. The scanned letter from Landon. A voice memo from Pastor Clemens, confessing what Elijah had told him. And finally, a photo of the whistle, tagged with one line. He gave this to a boy to keep him alive. That should mean something. Then he clicked send. It was done. He sat back, chest tight, not from fear but from clarity. The kind that comes after you've stopped bargaining with yourself. The next morning, it started small. A tweet. Then a headline. Then 3 more. Whistleblower exposes group home abuse in Grayson Hills. Confidential sketches tell story of cover-up. Pastor confirms youth worker warned days before death. The article didn't name Shaq. It didn't name Landon either. But it painted the picture clearly. A respected youth mentor, a 10-year-old witness, and a town that had been quiet for far too long. By noon, the whispers had turned into motion. 2 protesters stood on the courthouse steps holding signs, "Justice for Elijah," and "Protect our children." A local radio station picked up the story and read excerpts from the article on air. By 3 p.m., 5 more protesters had joined. By sunset, the crowd had tripled. Shaq stayed inside most of the day, not hiding, just letting it unfold without his hand on it, letting the truth breathe. At dusk, the phone rang. It was a blocked number. He didn't answer. 2 minutes later, a text came through from an unknown sender. "You don't know what you've started." Shaq deleted it without replying. That evening, he got the call from Pastor Clemens. They placed Landon in protective custody, the pastor said. State authorities, they're sending him to a safe home pending further investigation. Shaq closed his eyes. "Is he okay?" "He's scared," Clemens said. "But he's also proud. Said to tell you, thank you for not letting him be invisible." Shaq swallowed the lump in his throat. "Where are they sending him?" "They wouldn't say. For safety." He nodded slowly, even though no one could see him. He hung up and walked to the porch. The night was colder now, crisp, but alive with something new, possibility. Across the street, he could hear neighbors arguing. 2 men, loud but not violent. One defending the deputies, the other shouting something about Elijah, deserving better. Lines were being drawn. At 9:14 p.m., another headline hit. Deputy Mark Selwood resigns amid whistleblower report. No admission of guilt, no arrest, just resignation, early retirement, the kind that lets a man keep his pension while erasing the stain from his badge. Shaq stared at the screen, jaw tight. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was fracture. He clicked open the article. No quote from Selwood. No photo, just a small paragraph near the bottom that caught his eye. Authorities confirm a secondary internal investigation is underway following allegations of falsified reports, abuse of minors, and mishandling of evidence. It was vague, but real. The town was cracking open. At midnight, Shaq drove back to the cemetery. He didn't tell anyone, just needed to go. The graveyard was still. Same as always. Plot 7C, south corner beneath the old maple. He stood there for a long time. Said nothing. Just let the silence between them fill with everything that had happened. "They know now," he finally said. "Not everything, but enough." The wind moved through the leaves, soft as breath. "I don't know if it's enough to change them, but it's enough to make them uncomfortable, and that's a start." He looked down, the whistle now in his pocket again. Landon's safe. You did that. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He just stood there, like a promise. When he returned home, the porch light was still on. He stepped inside, locked the door behind him, and placed the sketchbook back on the table. The news was still running. Protesters now numbered in the dozens. Former group home residents were starting to speak up online. Anonymous at first, then louder. He knew the system wouldn't crumble overnight. But this wasn't about overnight. This was about planting something that couldn't be ignored anymore. The cycle of silence had been broken. He walked to the hallway and opened the guest room door. The bed was empty now, but the pillow still carried the shape of a small body. The air smelled faintly of graphite and childhood. He picked up the paper Landon had left behind, his last drawing before protective services took him. It showed Elijah standing tall beneath the maple. Not running this time, not shouting, just standing, at peace, and beside him a boy with a whistle in his hand, no longer hiding in the shadows. Time didn't slow, it didn't offer answers, wrapped in clarity. It simply passed like breath, like wind, like memory softening the edges of grief. Weeks had gone by since the story broke, since the photos became public, since names were whispered louder than anyone dared before. Grayson Hills wasn't healed. It might never be, but it had changed. And so had Shaq. The morning was clear, not bright, not loud, just clear. The kind of morning where the air feels honest, and the silence doesn't carry weight, it carries meaning. Shaq parked farther from the cemetery than usual. He didn't rush the walk. His steps were slow, measured, not out of sorrow, but out of presence. There was no urgency anymore, no chase. What needed to be said had been spoken. What needed to be heard was already echoing through the town. He reached the path, the one that curved toward the old maple tree. Plot 7C waited beneath it, like always. But today he wasn't alone. Landon walked beside him, a little taller than Shaq remembered, or maybe just standing straighter. The boy's hoodie was gone. Instead, he wore a simple jacket. His sketchbook was clutched in one hand, not hugged to his chest like armor, but held casually, like a notebook carried for ideas, for remembering, for honoring.
They didn't talk on the walk-up. They didn't need to.
When they reached the grave, they both stood still. The headstone was clean. Someone had been taking care of it. A single sunflower leaned against the base, fresh. The soil around it was soft, as though someone had come by recently and tended to it. Landon stepped forward first. He crouched beside the headstone, opened the sketchbook, and pulled out a single page. It was laminated now, preserved. The drawing of Elijah standing, not running, eyes open, hands at his sides. Peaceful. Landon placed it carefully beside the sunflower. Shaq watched, heart full, throat tight. The boy stood up, brushed his hands against his jeans, and looked at the stone. He gave me more than the whistle, Landon said. His voice didn't shake. He gave me a voice. Shaq nodded slowly. He did. And you gave me space to use it. Shaq smiled. Small and worn but real. I just listened. They stood there together, the wind brushing through the maple's leaves. The rustling wasn't sorrowful today. It was gentle, almost like the tree itself was offering a kind of applause. You ever wonder what he'd say if he were here now? Landon asked, eyes still on the grave. Every day, Shaq replied. I think he'd say he wasn't a hero. He wouldn't, Shaq agreed. But that's what makes him one. Landon was quiet a moment, then opened the sketchbook again. He flipped to a new page. This one was blank. He held the pencil in his right hand and started to draw, not with tension, not with fear, but with ease, as though he were finally drawing for himself. Shaq looked back at the town from the hill. He could see rooftops, the outline of the church steeple, the top of the rec center. Somewhere down there, conversations were happening. Debates, discomfort, change. He didn't know if the deputy who resigned would ever be charged. He didn't know if the group home would be shut down or reformed. But he knew that silence no longer had the last word. That belonged to the truth. He looked at Landon again, now scribbling the base of a tree, then adding a figure beneath it. Two, actually. A man and a boy, both facing forward, eyes open. Shaq stepped closer, leaned slightly to peek at the sketch. That us? He asked. Landon grinned. Maybe. Shaq chuckled softly. Don't give me too much hair. Gotta keep it honest. Landon laughed, genuinely. It was light, short, but it carried. Shaq let his hand rest on the boy's shoulder. Just for a moment. Whatever you decide to do next, he said, don't let them shrink you. You already made something they couldn't erase. Landon nodded. As they turned to leave, the wind carried one last gust through the leaves, making the laminated drawing flutter slightly before settling back down beside the sunflower. They didn't look back, because some goodbyes don't need to be said out loud. They're lived. They're drawn. They're remembered. In a town that chose silence, one boy's whisper became a movement. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Ask why some truths are buried, and who profits when they stay that way. Because justice doesn't just happen. It's told, drawn, and carried. And someone out there still needs to know they're not invisible.